You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. We all know that New Year's resolutions are hard. For example, everyone wants to go to the gym more, but actually dragging yourself out of bed in the morning and getting there is a whole other story. But what if you could make your resolutions automatic? Well, Acorns can't help you get to the gym, but they make it easy to start automatically saving and investing so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. And you don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. As we start off a new year, you don't need to feel like financial wellness is impossible. Acorns gives you small, simple steps to get you and your money on track. Head to acorns.com/CW or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid, non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/CW. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 482 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, when we left off last time, on Thursday, May 5th, 1864, in the Wilderness, Getty's Sixth Corps Division had attacked and kicked off the battle around the Brock Road intersection, but then found itself in a spot of trouble as the Confederate defenders there were giving as good as they got. Meanwhile, nearby, Second Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock was feverishly completing arrangements for his own attack.
The first of Hancock's divisions, an understrength 2-brigade formation led by Brigadier General Gershom Mott, started forward 15 minutes after Getty went in. And Mott's troops had an even rougher time, if such a thing were possible.
Mott's men were staggered by a sudden volley that crashed out at them through the woods. Those who continued to advance were hit by a second devastating volley that killed or wounded many of them and compelled those who were still on their feet to retreat. Within minutes, the division collapsed. One of Mott's brigade commanders, Colonel Robert McAllister, recalled how, quote, regiment after regiment, like a rolling wave, fell back, and all efforts to rally them were in vain.
McAllister acknowledged the intense Confederate fire played a role in the division's collapse, but so did the fact that many of the troops were short-timers whose enlistments were about to expire.
The next of Hancock's divisions to enter the fight was that of Major General David Birney. It did so one brigade at a time, since Birney's assignment was to support Getty's division rather than attack outright. But despite their support role, Birney's men took heavy casualties, among them Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, who had helped repel Pickett's charge 10 months earlier at Gettysburg. The struggle in the woods around the Brock Road intersection was epic, unlike few other fights anyone had experienced in the previous 3 years of war. Getty's chief of staff wrote, quote, usually when infantry meets infantry, the clash is brief. Here, neither side would give way, and the steady firing rolled and crackled from end to end of the contending lines as if it would never cease.
Across the way, Heath's Confederates kept up their defensive fire, pouring it into the Yankees as an unbroken hour of combat stretched into two. For the rebels, the fight was every bit as desperate as it was for their adversaries in blue.
Harry Heath, with 6,500 men in line, reckoned the enemy's strength at 25,000. A fair estimate, since Hancock already had 17,000 men engaged in the divisions of Getty, Mott, and Birney, with 2 more divisions moving up into position. If Hancock could coordinate them all for one hard, concerted push, Heath's line would crack.
Robert E. Lee knew that Heath needed help, and so at 5 p.m. he recalled Wilcox's division, which he had sent off to make contact with Ewell's troops to the north, thus providing a connection between Hill's Corps and Ewell's Corps.
When Cadmus Wilcox got the recall order, he was at the tuning farm, having linked up with Ewell's troops less than an hour before. Now he came pounding back, while his 2 rear brigades, those closest to the Orange Plank Road, were already on the way to assist Heath after receiving direct orders from Robert E. Lee. Wilcox rode ahead, found Heath not far behind the battle lines, and discovered that Heath had already fed his, that is Wilcox's, lead brigade into the fight. Heath later said, "I gave him my views, which were briefly that, having successfully resisted all of the enemy's attacks up to the present time, I thought we should now, in our turn, attack."
Wilcox agreed, and both generals' views were perfectly in keeping with the Army of Northern Virginia's aggressive command culture, where meeting attack with counterattack was almost reflexive.
Exactly. So, Wilcox's brigades, one by one, as they arrived on the scene, attacked the Federals. Unable to see anything of the enemy because of the trees, brush, and smoke, Wilcox deployed his men partly by advice from Heath and partly by earshot, explaining later, "Where the firing was heaviest, there my brigades would be ordered."
The 1st Brigade, 5 South Carolina regiments led by Brigadier General Samuel McGowan, piled through the center of Heath's line and went forward, keening the rebel yell. As it turned out, this was a mistake. One officer admitted, quote, "We should have charged without uttering a word until within a few yards of the Federal line. As it was, we drew upon ourselves a terrific volley of musketry."
The heavy Federal fire slowed McGowan's attack. So did the difficult terrain. So did the appalling realization that Heath's troops, now behind McGowan's men, were firing into their backs in a misguided attempt to assist the attack. Although the South Carolinians managed to overrun and capture one of the Union guns deployed on the Orange Plank Road, before they could take it away, they were forced to withdraw and had to leave it.
Wilcox's other brigades had similar experiences. When all was said and done, Heath regretted suggesting Wilcox to attack, confessing, quote, "I should have left well enough alone."
Nevertheless, the Confederates' aggressiveness did yield one important benefit. It put the Federals in a defensive frame of mind, even as Winfield Scott Hancock fed his last 2 divisions into the fight. The Yankee push hit the rebels hard, but the thoughts of the Federal commanders were less on achieving a breakthrough than on sheer survival. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman, a staff officer at Meade's headquarters, had been sent to report on the situation in Hancock's sector, and Lyman's dispatch reflected the prevailing sentiment. Quote, "We barely hold our own. On the right, the pressure is heavy. General Hancock thinks he can hold the Plank and Brock roads in front of which he is, but he can't advance." Lyman concluded, "Fresh troops would be most advisable."
Fresh Federal troops were already on the way, though not to reinforce Hancock on his part of the front. That's because Union signalmen had earlier witnessed an unidentified Confederate column marching south from the tuning farm toward the Orange Plank Road. They were Wilcox's men, responding to Robert E. Lee's recall order, but Ulysses S. Grant assumed the column must represent a detachment from Ewell's corps.
Grant's wrong assumption led him to advise Meade to renew the attack against Ewell around Saunders Field, because he mistakenly believed that with Ewell sending troops south to assist A.P. Hill, then Ewell's lines must therefore be more weakly held than before. Well, at the same time, Grant suggested that Wadsworth's division strike the left flank of Hill's troops defending the Plank Road.
Already in reserve near the Lacey House on the Orange Turnpike, Wadsworth's division was only a mile northwest of A.P. Hill's left flank. But while that mile may have looked innocuous when viewed on Grant's map, in reality it was typical wilderness terrain consisting of trackless thickets with swampy patches thrown in for good measure.
Embarrassed by his division's poor performance earlier in the day, and anxious to make amends, James Wadsworth set off gamely enough, but once again dense brush and thick stands of second-growth timber and boggy ground complicated his efforts to get his troops where they had been ordered to go. Worse, one of his brigades collided with rebel pickets, panicked, and broke, delaying the whole operation for the time it took officers to rally them and get them back into line.
But at 7 p.m., the first of Wadsworth's men stumbled into the Brock Road battle area. It was a tentative, cautious movement, as they were unsure of the situation. But actually, if they stayed where they were and were reinforced, they were perfectly positioned to wreck A.P. Hill's left flank.
The only Confederate unit at hand was a 150-man Alabama battalion detailed to guard Union prisoners. In desperation, Robert E. Lee ordered the Alabamans to attack. They did so, hollering as they went, and their charge shook the Federals so badly that they beat a quick retreat and faded back into the woods.
And that was the last major development in the 3-hour engagement around the Brock Road, Orange Plank Road intersection. As night descended, Hancock suspended his attacks and ordered his men to start throwing up defensive works.
A.P. Hill's Confederates had even more reason to start building field works. They were outnumbered and needed to do some reorganizing since units had been shuffled about. But the men were exhausted, and rather than set them to work, Robert E. Lee thought it better to let them get some rest. After all, Longstreet's corps would be up at daybreak to relieve them.
And so the day's fighting flickered out, with the opposing armies, in some places, within a stone's throw of each other.
Robert E. Lee had reason to be pleased with the just concluded fighting on May 5th. He had halted the Federal Army's advance while it was still in the wilderness and forced the Yankees to fight in that forbidding terrain, which favored the defender.
Even though he was well aware of the benefits of fighting on the defensive in the wilderness, still, during the first day's fighting, Lee had been searching for a way to strike the Federals.
Twice he had urged Dick Ewell to see if there was a way he might maneuver so as to insert his corps between the Federal Army and the Rapidan crossings, but it just wasn't possible. Nevertheless, Longstreet's fresh corps was expected to arrive by midnight, and once it was up, Lee anticipated launching a major counterattack against the enemy.
On the Federal side, Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade ought to have been less than pleased with the results of the day's fighting. Typically, though, Grant chose to see the glass as half full rather than half empty.
Grant told his staff that because neither Burnside's corps, on the Federal side, nor Longstreet's corps, on the Confederate side, had yet been engaged, and the troops of both armies had spent the day mostly struggling through thickets and fighting for position, that May 5th had, quote, not been much of a test of strength.
Grant continued, quote, I feel pretty well satisfied with the result of the engagement, for it is evident that Lee attempted by a bold movement to strike this army in the flank before it could be put into line of battle and be prepared to fight to advantage. But in this he has failed.
Although Grant was wrong about Lee's intentions on May 5th, both he and Meade accurately guessed that A.P. Hill's 2 divisions down on the Orange Plank Road had suffered severely and so would be vulnerable to a renewed federal assault in that sector. So they made plans to launch a major attack on A.P. Hill early on the morning of Friday, May 6th.
To the north, Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps and Uncle John Sedgwick's 6th Corps would pin down Ewell's Confederates in the Orange Plank Road sector.
To the south, Hancock's 2nd Corps, reinforced by the divisions of Getty and Wadsworth, would strike west along the Orange Plank Road. Meanwhile, to support Hancock's effort, Burnside's 9th Corps would move into the gap between the Turnpike and the Plank Road and attack A.P. Hill's left flank and rear.
It was a good plan, although it was complicated by the fact that Burnside reported to Grant, not Meade, thanks to 9th Corps' awkward independent status.
That arrangement, made in deference to Ambrose Burnside's rank, had made sense when 9th Corps was guarding the railroad to the Army of the Potomac's rear. But now that Burnside had crossed the Rapidan and was maneuvering together with the rest of the army, it was complicating things.
As a result, Meade doubted that Burnside could get into position on time on the morning of the 6th, so he asked Grant to delay the attack. Grant reluctantly gave him an extra 30 minutes, until 5 a.m., but no more.
Well, as it turned out, Robert E. Lee attacked first anyway. During the night, he'd ordered Ewell to attack the Federals in the Orange Turnpike sector at dawn, probably with the idea of diverting enemy attention from A.P. Hill's beleaguered divisions to the south along the Orange Plank Road. In any case, Dick Ewell dutifully attacked the Federal works at 4:45 on the morning of May 6th.
On the Federal side, when the Confederate assault began, Sedgwick, who at the time was preparing to kick off his own 5 a.m. attack, joked that Ewell's watch must be a quarter-hour fast.
Although Ewell's advance made little headway, it nonetheless upset the Yankees' plans, and so proved to be an unintentionally successful spoiling attack.
Sedgwick fended off the initial attack by Ewell's Confederates, then launched a brief, weak 2-brigade assault of his own that got nowhere. In fact, most of 6th Corps simply remained on the defensive.
A bit to the south, 5th Corps never left its works, since Warren declined to attack until Sedgwick's entire force went forward. Learning of the delay, Meade insisted Warren advance, but Warren stubbornly refused. 5th Corps had been burned the day before when it had attacked without support, and Warren wasn't eager to repeat the experience. And so, on the 6th, the morning wore into late afternoon, and in the Orange Turnpike sector, nothing like a major Federal attack ever developed.
On the other hand, down in the Plank Road sector, Hancock attacked just as ordered. At 5 a.m., he advanced with 5 divisions, 3 of his own and 1 each from the other 2 corps.
Heath and Wilcox's Confederates, who were hungry, thirsty, and fought out from the day before, were in no condition to repel a major enemy attack here on the morning of the 6th. The rebels would argue for years over who was to blame for what happened next, but as the Federal assault rolled forward through the early morning light, the Confederate soldiers fired a few half-hearted shots, then abandoned their positions and started for the rear.
One Confederate called the rout, quote, unquote, disgraceful, but another rejected such an assessment, saying, quote, There was no panic and no great haste. The men seemed to fall back from the deliberate conviction that it was impossible to hold the ground and, of course, foolish to attempt it. It was mortifying, but it was only what every veteran has experienced.
Only 2 of 8 Confederate brigades held their ground even briefly. The others simply broke to the rear, and within minutes, hundreds of rebel soldiers were streaming past the tap house and the tents of Lee's headquarters, pitched in the yard. 16 Confederate artillery pieces were posted just east of the house, but the gunners had to wait for the skedaddling rebel infantry to get out of the way before they could open fire.
Once that happened, though, they sent a blast of canister tearing across the clearing, then another, desperately trying to keep the Yankees at bay. But without infantry support, the rebel guns alone couldn't hope to hold the enemy back forever.
Robert E. Lee rode down the plank road, beside himself with rage, not at all the cool Southern gentleman of legend. He spoke, quote-unquote, very roughly to the fleeing rebel soldiers, and to one officer exploded, quote, "My God, General McGowan, is this splendid brigade of yours running like a flock of geese?"
Samuel McGowan replied that his men simply needed a place to rally, but that was small comfort to Robert E. Lee, since, with Longstreet not yet up, a place to rally might not exist.
Winfield Scott Hancock, trailing behind his advancing divisions, was as delighted as Lee was appalled. To one of Meade's staff officers, he boomed happily, "We are driving them, sir. Tell General Meade we are driving them most beautifully."
But the staff officer had some bad news, and he told Hancock that Burnside had only 1 division in position and was not yet ready to attack.
Hancock growled, "I knew it. Just what I expected. If he would attack now, we would smash A.P. Hill to pieces."
Burnside was indeed late, and the staff officer's report was overly optimistic, since not a single 9th Corps division was in position to attack the Confederates.
Having bivouacked just south of Germanna Ford the previous night, Burnside's men had resumed their march at 2 a.m., but at 6:30 on the morning of May 6th, with the sound of musketry and cannon fire rumbling to the south, Burnside halted the column so his men could get some rest. Now, that sounds completely irresponsible until you recall that his corps had marched 40 miles in 36 hours with about 4 hours rest. Soldiers simply could not be driven so hard and still be expected to fight.
Or perhaps they could, because while Burnside's Federals boiled their morning coffee, Longstreet's Confederates appeared, tramping up the Orange Plank Road. They had been marching since 3 a.m., had indeed been marching for 35 of the last 40 hours, but they arrived on the battlefield ready to whip the Yankees.
Longstreet's troops, swinging along full of confidence, shot pointed comments at A.P. Hill's fleeing men. Ordinarily, Old Pete liked to gather his full strength before launching an attack, but clearly there wasn't time for that here, so he would feed each brigade into the fight as soon as it arrived. It wasn't easily done. Like everyone else, Longstreet's men had to contend with the tangled terrain of the wilderness, but they also had to deal with A.P. Hill's men who were retreating to the west. In later years, Longstreet's chief of staff would say of the Corps' arrival on the battlefield, "I have always thought that in its entire splendid history, the simple act of forming line in that dense undergrowth, under heavy fire, and with the 3rd Corps men pushing through the ranks, was perhaps its greatest performance for steadiness and inflexible courage and discipline."
As the first of Longstreet's brigades advanced past him, Robert E. Lee rode up to its commander, Brigadier General John Gregg, and inquired, "General, what brigade is this?" When told it was the Texas Brigade, Lee said, "I am glad to see it."
Lee told Gregg to inform his troops that he would be watching them, so when his command was in position, Gregg shouted, "Attention, Texas Brigade! The eyes of General Lee are upon you! Forward! March!" Nobody who witnessed the scene would ever forget it. As the brigade moved forward, Lee shouted encouragement, and the Texans responded with a yell and a storm of emotion that brought tears to men's eyes. Lee attempted to accompany these sons of the Lone Star State into action, but they would have none of it. "Go back, General Lee, go back," they shouted, and when he showed no signs of stopping, they slowed their steps, and several men grabbed the bridle of Lee's horse, Traveler, and John Gregg personally pleaded with Lee to go to the rear. Finally, he agreed, and the 800 Texans went forward without him. Fewer than 250 would still be standing at the end of the day.
Although Longstreet's two-division attack went in piecemeal, it was still enough to push back the Federals, who had lost quite a bit of unit cohesion during their advance and early success. As a result, Hancock's men couldn't withstand the assault by these fresh Confederate troops.
The Federals fell back about halfway to their original positions. So, barely 2 hours after his attack had rolled forward, Winfield Scott Hancock saw his glittering early morning triumph turn into a stalemate. At 10 minutes after 7, he informed George Meade, "They are pressing us on the road a great deal. If more force were here now, I could use it. I am filling up the cartridge boxes of the men who are returning and reestablishing my lines."
Besides his men's retrograde movement, which was bad enough, Hancock was troubled by the fact that only 2 of Longstreet's divisions had been identified on the battlefield, so that left the 3rd, Pickett's division, unaccounted for, as well as the 3rd Division of A.P. Hill's Corps, that of Major General Richard Anderson.
Hard-won experience had taught the generals of the Army of the Potomac to be wary of Confederate flank attacks, so Hancock worried about these missing enemy divisions and his exposed left. Sure enough, reports began to come in about an unidentified Confederate force in the vicinity of Todd's Tavern on the Brock Road, 4 miles south of Hancock's lines.
As it turned out, the reports were false. As y'all will recall, Pickett's division was nowhere near the battlefield, having been left back near Richmond, and Anderson's division was still making its way up the Orange Plank Road. But nevertheless, concern for his left flank led Hancock to hold back the better part of 2 divisions, just in case.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
Napoleon Bonaparte rose from obscurity to become the most powerful and significant figure in modern history. Over 200 years after his death, people are still debating his legacy. He was a man of contradictions, a tyrant and a reformer, a liberator and an oppressor, a revolutionary and a reactionary. His biography reads like a novel, and his influence is almost beyond measure. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast, and every month I delve into the turbulent life and times of one of the greatest characters in history, and explore the world that shaped him in all its glory and tragedy. It's a story of great battles and campaigns, political intrigue, and massive social and economic change. But it's also a story about people, populated with remarkable characters. I hope you'll join me as I examine this fascinating era of history. Find The Age of Napoleon wherever you get your podcasts.
On the Federal side, as the morning of the 6th wore on, the troops of Burnside's 9th Corps began to arrive on the battlefield, but instead of going into action together, one of its 3 divisions was kept in reserve by Meade's headquarters and later parceled out to reinforce other formations.
Burnside's remaining 2 divisions continued down the Parker Store Road, and at 8 a.m., Meade reassured Hancock that, quote, 2 of Burnside's divisions have advanced nearly to Parker's Store. They ought to be engaged now and will relieve you.
But, in fact, 9th Corps was stalled in front of the tuning farm. Burnside and his staff gazed at the high ground there held by the Confederates and pondered what to do. No one liked the idea of taking the high ground by assault, but no one could think of a better way to resume the march. In any case, for over an hour, Burnside's advance remained at a standstill.
Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee was thinking of ways to turn the situation to the Confederates' advantage. Having staved off disaster in the Brock Road, Orange Plank Road sector, he could now search for a way to seize the initiative and launch a major attack of his own.
Anderson's division had reached the field, and although it belonged to A.P. Hill's corps, Lee now assigned it temporarily to Longstreet. Lee also sent his chief engineer, Major General Martin L. Smith, to scout the ground south of the Plank Road. Smith returned from his reconnaissance around 10 a.m. and reported to Longstreet that he had found an unfinished railroad bed just south of the Orange Plank Road, and it offered the Confederates an unguarded path to the Union left flank.
Old Pete summoned his chief of staff, 26-year-old G. Moxley Sorrell, and told him, "Colonel, there is a fine chance of a great attack on our right." Then, as he waved his arm to the south, Longstreet said, "If you will quickly get into those woods, some brigades will be found much scattered from the fight. Collect them and take charge."
"Hit them hard," Longstreet continued, "but not until you have everything ready." Old Pete said he would be listening for the sounds of battle to the south that signaled the start of Sorrell's assault on the Federal left, and then he would order the rebel troops astride the Plank Road to attack as well.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Voices of the Civil War, The Wilderness, by the editors of Time Life Books.
Throughout the course of the podcast, we've recommended titles in this outstanding series, and we'll do so again here with The Wilderness. Each of the books in the series is packed with first-hand accounts that offer amazing insights into what the soldiers saw, heard, thought, and felt as they took part in these battles.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Christian B., John R., Chris M., and Claybird did this past week.
Then a big thank you to Jimmy R. for his recent donation. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.